William will receive the old photo box. The lawyer's voice rang out clear and deliberate, slicing through the stillness of the funeral hall like a thin blade of ice. For a moment, no one moved. Even the rain against the window seemed to pause as if the weather itself wanted to listen. I lifted my head. The room was lined with polished oak panels gleaming under the dim chandeliers. The air carried a strange mixture of lilies, candle wax, and burnt coffee, the kind of scent that stays long after people leave. Around the table, the family sat in quiet formation, the way soldiers wait for orders they already know won't favor them. On the table, between thick folders of legal documents, sat a single, small wooden box. It looked almost embarrassed to be there, too ordinary, too human, among all the talk of stocks, estates, and percentages. I felt the eyes before I met them. Margaret, my stepmother, with her measured half-smile that always managed to sound like an insult, even when she didn't speak. Jonathan, my half-brother, lounging back in his chair, wearing his father's cufflinks as if inheritance were a personality trait. Elaine, my wife, composed and distant, her fingers circling the silver ring she hadn't taken off since our wedding day. And Daniel, my son, barely hiding the grin that said more than words could. Outside, Charleston's sky hung heavy, the color of iron. Rain traced slow rivers down the tall windows. The oaks on the front lawn bowed under the weight of water. My father, Charles Carter, had been buried less than an hour ago. The mud on his grave hadn't even settled yet. Here we were dividing his legacy like it were dessert after a long meal. Grace Monroe, the family attorney, continued in that careful, neutral tone of someone paid not to feel. To Margaret and Jonathan, controlling shares of Carter Holdings, the riverfront estate, and the investment accounts. To Elaine and Daniel, full rights to the vehicle collection and annual dividend trust. She paused. Then she looked up directly at me. To William Carter, she repeated, her voice dropping slightly. I leave the old photo box. A silence spread through the room, thick and knowing. You could almost hear the air tighten. Daniel broke it first. Guess Grandpa knew what he was doing, he said, grinning at his mother. A few soft laughs followed. I didn't move, didn't speak. Just looked down at my hands, hands that had built the first models of Carter & Sons hands that used to be trusted until they weren't. Margaret tilted her head. How touching, she said, the pity in her voice sharp as glass. Your father always said you valued memories more than money, Jonathan added, almost cheerfully. Well, memories appreciate differently, don't they? Elaine placed her hand on my shoulder. It was meant to look supportive, but I could feel the distance in it. I gave a small nod, the kind that ends conversations. When Grace closed the folder, everyone rose at once, like the final act of a play they'd rehearsed for years. The scrape of chairs against the hardwood echoed longer than any goodbye. I stayed seated. The wooden box sat before me, unassuming, patient. Sophie, my daughter. The youngest walked over quietly and touched my shoulder. Her eyes were soft, unspoiled by the cynicism that had taken root in the rest of them. Let's go home, Dad, she whispered. I nodded. Grace walked up, placed the box gently into my hands. Her eyes met mine for a brief second. There was something there, regret maybe, but it disappeared as quickly as it came. Your father wanted you to have this himself, she said simply. I thanked her and left. The rain had stopped by the time we stepped outside, but the ground still glistened. The driveway was lined with black sedans and European SUVs polished like armor. At the far end, my old truck waited, dull, muddy, and honest. Sophie drove. Neither of us spoke. The wipers brushed rhythmically against the glass like a slow metronome counting down to something unnamed. The box sat on my lap. I didn't open it. I just let its weight remind me that even emptiness can be heavy. At home, the small house by the river, I set it on my desk. The air smelled faintly of sawdust and rain. When I lifted the lid, a soft creak escaped, and a breath of cedar dust rose like smoke. Inside was a stack of photographs, edges curled, colors faded, time softened, but not erased. I sifted through them slowly. There was my father beside a bulldozer, sunburned and grinning. The first Carter Holdings ribbon cutting, his hand gripping the scissors too tightly. My mother before the illness, eyes bright, hair caught in the wind. And then one photo stopped me cold. My father stood in front of Harbor Bank, the late afternoon sun slicing across his face. The photo was old 1980s maybe, but his presence was unmistakable, still deliberate, unflinching. In the bottom corner, scrawled in his blue ink that had nearly faded with time, were the words, "For my son who remembers. Safe 47A." I stared at the handwriting, tracing the letters with my thumb. He always wrote his sevens with a line through them, a habit he'd picked up studying in London after the war. Even now, decades later, I could recognize it instantly. A vault, a key, a message. I sat back, the lamplight washing over the photo, and for the first time in years, I felt something stir that wasn't bitterness, curiosity. Outside, the river whispered against the banks. Sophie appeared at the door, carrying 2 mugs of tea. "Dad," she said softly. "They were awful today." I smiled faintly. "It's fine, sweetheart. I've learned to stop expecting better." She glanced at the box. "Grandpa never gave anything without a reason. Maybe this is his way of talking to you." I looked at her and nodded slowly. "Maybe it is." I turned the photograph once more toward the light. Behind him, the bank doors were half open, a sliver of brightness spilling out like an invitation. Safe 47A. The words echoed in my head, calm and persistent, the way my father used to pause before a chess move. I could almost hear his voice again, low and certain. The game's never over until the last piece stops moving. I placed the photo back in the box, closed the lid. The porch light cast a pale glow across the desk, touching the grain of the wood. The room fell into a silence that felt almost alive. And sitting there, I had the sudden, unmistakable feeling that my father was still somewhere in that room, waiting for me to make the next move in the game he'd left unfinished. The night slid into the house like a damp whisper, that peculiar Charleston cold that creeps under doors and smells faintly of the river. I turned on the desk lamp, a single low amber light spilling across the wood. The old wooden box sat there still and patient, as if listening. I pulled it closer and tipped the photographs out, spreading them across the desk. The paper edges rustled dryly under my fingers. The air filled with the smell of dust, old paper, and a trace of mildew, the scent of an attic no one has opened in years. Most of the photos were of work sites, scaffolding helmets, rough hands pointing at blueprints. Faces I recognized, men, long gone, projects, long finished. A few were from Sullivan's Island, our family squinting against the sunlight, t-shirts wrinkled from the sea wind. But my eyes always came back to one photograph. My father stood in front of a building marked Harbor Bank. The late light of some forgotten afternoon fell across his forehead and the bridge of his nose. He held his hat at his side. His shoulder turned slightly, as if he'd just heard someone call his name. In the corner, fading blue ink curved across the edge of the paper, in his neat, familiar hand, writing, I'd known all my childhood, tight, deliberate, with the crossed sevens he'd picked up during his years working overseas. For my son who remembers. Safe 47A. The door opened quietly behind me. Sophie came in wearing a soft wool sweater, her hair tied back, eyes still tired from a hospital shift. She sat opposite me and began gathering the photographs into small, careful stacks, so the draft from the hallway wouldn't scatter them. She looked at the handwriting and said she recognized it immediately. "Grandpa always used dark blue fountain pen ink," she said. "It bleeds into the paper, leaves a soft ring like smoke." I nodded. "He left something behind." I said something that was meant to wait until now. We leaned over the Harbor Bank photo together, comparing the angle, the signage, the style of the lettering painted on the wall. "These details aren't accidental," I told her. "He never stood anywhere without a reason." Sophie pulled the lamp closer. Light brushed across the glossy surface, bringing every speck of dust to life. "There might be a code on the film edge," she said. "If it's film stock, it should have a date." I lifted the photo carefully, slipped a fingernail under the matting, and eased it loose. Along the thin white border, faint numbers appeared, an 8, a 7, and a series of tiny letters, half erased by time. Sophie squinted, then searched her phone. "It's probably from 1987, she whispered after a moment. "That's the year this kind of film was made." 1987. The year Carter Holdings doubled in size. The year my father stopped telling me about the company. Wind pressed against the windows, making them tremble softly. I remembered something he used to say: the things that matter most rarely look valuable. When I was young, I'd said that if something truly mattered, people would see it right away. He'd smiled, said that learning to see is its own kind of work, just like building. I spread the photo beside others' construction sites, buildings, men in hard hats. I studied the way he stood in each one, how his shoulders tilted where his hands rested. He didn't pose. He marked locations. Sophie poured more coffee. The warmth filled the kitchen, bitter and grounding. "If 47A is a vault number," she said, "it's probably at that same bank. And if it's still active, someone's been paying the fees." "Usually the bank sends notices when boxes go dormant," I said. "But if someone prepaid or left instructions under another name, it could stay untouched for decades." Sophie leaned back, her eyes bright. "He wrote for my son, who remembers. Maybe he trusted that you'd be the one to notice. Maybe your name's on something we don't know about yet." I felt something ease in my chest, a kind of warmth that wasn't from the coffee. It felt like a hand, his hand resting gently between my shoulders. I went to the cabinet and found an old leather-bound notebook, edges, worn pages, yellowed. My father's travel log. It still smelled faintly of ink and tobacco. I flipped through pages filled with notes, sketches, names. Savannah Bay Street, Inspection Tuesday. Then a short line scribbled smaller than the rest, Harbor Secured 47A under WC. I handed the book to Sophie. She smiled faintly. "WC, that's you. Grandpa used to sign his drawings like that when you first started working with him. 3 taps on the paper corner right, like knocking before entering." I laughed under my breath. He said it was good luck. Maybe it still is. Midnight passed. The house had gone still, the only sound the river touching the dock pilings outside. I ran a finger along the edge of the photo and felt a faint ridge. Something sharp had once pressed there. Tilting it toward the light, I caught a small glint, a hair-thin groove just visible at the right angle. I lowered my face close. The paper fibers glimmered like frost. And there it was, etched so small, it might have vanished, if not for the light. 47A. Not ink, not handwriting. Engraved. The kind of marking my father used to carve inside his watches, tiny secret made to look like scratches to anyone else. Sophie bent closer, her voice barely a breath. He carved it again, just in case the ink disappeared. Something inside me flickered warm and steady like a coal catching light. I placed the photo back at the center of the table, squared the edges as if finishing a drawing. One number written, one number carved, a note in his journal, a photograph in front of a bank door. My father had built a trail, careful, patient, exact, and left it waiting for me to follow. "We're going to Savannah tomorrow," I said quietly. "No waiting, no asking permission." Sophie nodded. "I'll switch my shift. If Harbor Bank still exists, we'll need ID, maybe proof of inheritance. I'll handle it." I gathered the photos back into the box, but kept the Harbor Bank one separate, sliding it into a clear plastic sleeve and into my coat pocket. The house felt warmer now, not from the lamp or the coffee, but from a small, steady sense of direction. For the first time in years, I wasn't standing still in someone else's ending. I washed the mugs, the sound of hot water echoing against porcelain. Sophie leaned in the doorway. "Are you scared?" she asked. "A little," I admitted. "Scared of finding what I don't want to know. Scared of finding nothing at all. But mostly scared of missing something he meant me to find." We turned off the lights, leaving only the porch lamp glowing faintly across the floor. I drew the curtain aside and looked out at the river, its surface like liquid metal, the bridge lights stretching long and trembling. The wooden box sat closed, yet I could still feel it open somewhere in the room. The scent of old paper lingered soft and persistent. As I passed the desk, my hand brushed against the envelope in my coat pocket. I touched the photo through the plastic, felt the faint ridge of that carved number under my fingertip. A small heartbeat of truth, steady and sure. The night deepened, and the city sounds fell away like a ship pulling from the dock. I exhaled, turned off the lamp. Only the faint light from the porch traced a narrow line across the desk, the same color as memory. Everything sat exactly where it needed to be, and I knew when morning came it would all begin to move. Morning crept in through the thin slits of the curtain, turning the edge of the river into a sheet of trembling gold. The light caught the ripples, and for a moment everything outside looked weightless. My phone buzzed on the nightstand. A message from Margaret, short and cold. "Lunch at the house. In memory of your father." Noon sharp. No invitation, just an order. I sat up, the floor cool under my feet. The morning light stretched across the wooden frame of the window and caught on the coat I'd hung the night before. From the kitchen came the smell of coffee mixing with the damp breath of the river. Sophie was already there, hair tied back, moving quietly. "Margaret wants the family together," I said. "I'm going." She turned, spoon paused midair. "Are you sure you want to?" "There are meals you don't want," I said, "but you show up for them anyway." The house on Bay Street hadn't changed, wide, bright, curated to death. The kind of order that felt like it came with rules written in invisible ink. Roses bloomed too neatly in the garden. The air smelled like perfume and polished wood. When the butler opened the door, the light was sharp, sterile. In the dining room, the long white tablecloth gleamed. Silverware glinted like a row of scalpels. Margaret sat at the head, Jonathan to her right, Elaine and Daniel to the left. The empty seat waited at the far end for me. They smiled the way people do when politeness is armor. No one stood. Margaret began with a voice full of ceremony. "Today is to honor Charles. He'd be happy to see us together like this." Jonathan picked up immediately, voice crisp, almost rehearsed. He spoke about restructuring, consolidation, expanding into the Midwest. Elaine joined in her tone, smooth as glass, suggesting the Savannah estate could fetch a fine price if they sold early, that the vintage cars might go to auction to fund the family foundation. Daniel leaned forward, animated, explaining a marketing plan to refresh the Carter image. It sounded less like a memorial than a shareholders' meeting. I stayed quiet, the clinking of knives and forks filling the pauses. No one spoke of my father as a man, only as an asset, a brand, a story to monetize. Around the table, I realized each of them had already claimed a piece of him. When the main course arrived, I set my glass down and asked softly, "Has anyone ever heard of Harbor Bank in Savannah?" The words landed like stones in still water. The table went silent. Jonathan looked up, frowning. I found a photograph, I said, of father standing in front of it. There was something written on it, 47A. Daniel dropped his knife. The sound of metal hitting porcelain cut through the air. Elaine glanced at Margaret, then at Jonathan. The three of them changed the subject in one smooth, practiced pivot, as if I'd mentioned the weather. Jonathan waved to the butler for more wine. Margaret smiled the way she did when she wanted to end a conversation. "Charles loved taking photos," she said. "He kept hundreds. I'm sure it's just another one of those." Maybe I said. Maybe it is. But in that second, Jonathan's eyes betrayed him, a flicker, a muscle tightening near the jaw. Recognition, quickly hidden. The meal went on, full of laughter and empty words. Daniel leaned closer to me, his voice quiet but sharp. "Don't make this harder than it has to be, Dad. Some things in the family are better left alone. Everything's been settled." I looked straight at him, said nothing, and cut another piece of meat. He smiled at Elaine, confident, secure in the shadow he thought would always cover him. When dessert came, Margaret stood, glass raised. "To a new era for Carter Holdings," she declared. Jonathan clinked glasses with Elaine. Daniel laughed too loud, too proud. The sound echoed off the marble walls like a metallic clang. I set my napkin down. I have somewhere to be. No one stopped me. In the hallway, I heard the click of heels. Elaine's voice, low, tense. She was speaking to Jonathan. I stopped near the corner, unseen. Her words came through in fragments. "Is everything sealed off? Can he find anything?" Jonathan answered, calm and certain. "As long as we control the records and the bank, it's over." A pause. Then Elaine said, "You don't understand him. He won't stop." Jonathan laughed quietly. "Everyone stops. You just have to find their price." I turned away before I heard more. By the time I reached the front door, sunlight poured through the tall glass windows, bouncing off the polished stone floor. My footsteps echoed in the emptiness. Outside, the air felt cleaner, though my chest stayed heavy. At the gate, Sophie waited in the car. She didn't ask, just looked at me. "They haven't changed," I said. Her lips pressed into a line. She nodded once and started the engine. Charleston shimmered in the late afternoon, the sky so bright it almost hurt. The wind from the river carried salt and the faint scent of oil from the docks. I rolled the window down, breathing in the heat, the noise, the life of a city that had learned how to hide its ghosts. "Are you going to tell them?" Sophie asked as we crossed the bridge. "About Savannah?" "No," I said. "The fewer who know, the better." She nodded, eyes on the road, both hands steady on the wheel. The sunlight caught the windshield, and for a moment I saw my reflection mixed with the moving water, below older lined but somehow clearer. It struck me then that my father hadn't left that photo for me to dwell on the past. He'd left it so I'd finish what he couldn't. When we got home, I took the photo from its sleeve and laid it on the desk beside the wooden box. The number 47A seemed to gleam under the lamp, sharper now, as if lit from within. "We leave tomorrow," I said. "Savannah. No more waiting." Sophie smiled faintly. "So you've made your choice?" "I have." I closed the curtains. Outside, the river reflected the last silver of daylight. Fishing boats rocked in the distance, their lights flickering like cautious hope. I placed the photo on the desk, gathered a few papers, checked my wallet, my license, my ID. The number kept repeating in my mind, steady and rhythmic, 47, A like the ticking of the clock on the wall. I sat for a while longer, tracing the faded words with my thumb. For my son who remembers. I remember I whispered, "And I'm coming to find you." Then I turned off the light. The room fell quiet save for the wind slipping through the window frame and the river breathing outside, steady as sleep. The morning in Savannah felt wrapped in silver, a thin, quiet light drifting over the cobblestones that still held the breath of the river from the night before. The air carried the scent of moss salt and early coffee weaving between the branches of old oaks heavy with hanging Spanish moss. I drove slowly along the riverfront tires, whispering over damp bricks, the sound echoing off the red brick walls that had stood for a century. In the passenger seat, Sophie held the photograph and her gaze following the streets outside. Her voice was soft, half-thought. She said the building in the picture might still be there at the corner of bay and river. I nodded without answering. And then it appeared Harbor Bank, exactly as in my father's photo taken nearly 40 years ago. The same red brick, the same white arch windows, the same brass sign dulled by time but catching light like memory. For a moment I just stood by the car, watching the building breathe in the sunlight. It felt like stepping into the photograph itself, as if my father were still standing just out of frame, waiting. Inside, the air was cool and still, carrying the faint scent of paper, oak, polish, and metal. A woman emerged from behind the counter, tall, mid-50s, composed the kind of presence that came from years of quiet authority. Her name tag read, Anna Whitfield, branch manager. She greeted me with the careful politeness of someone accustomed to requests from the past. I told her I wanted to inquire about Safe Deposit Box 47A, opened in 1987 under the name Charles Carter. She studied me for a moment, then gestured toward a seat. Her voice, when she spoke, had the calm rhythm of someone who measured her words by habit. She said she would check the archives. The waiting area was almost empty. Somewhere deep inside, a printer clattered steadily. Light filtered through frosted glass, turning dust into slow-moving stars. Sophie sat beside me, the photograph still in her hands. She whispered that the window behind us looked exactly like the one in the picture, only cleaner, now brighter. I looked down at my hands. The joints trembled slightly. When Anna returned, she carried a pale yellow folder, the corners worn soft. She set it on the table and opened it carefully. The first page was stamped in typewriter ink, Safe Deposit Box 47A. Opened August 12, 1987. Account holder Charles Carter. Below, 2 black ink signatures, his and mine. I stared at the younger version of my name written in the quick, uncertain hand of a man still trying to become someone. My breath caught. That was my signature from when I worked under him, long before I knew what I didn't know. Anna looked up. "According to our records," she said gently, "you're listed as the secondary authorized holder. The authorization is still valid." My voice came quieter than I expected. "Does it say when the box was last accessed?" She flipped through several pages, her finger tracing a column of dates. "September 1987, she said finally. "Only one signature, Charles Carter's. No activity since." Sophie leaned forward. "What about the payment records? The storage fees?" Anna frowned slightly, turned another page, and found a line highlighted in red, paid through 2037. She looked at me. "Someone prepaid 50 years of maintenance," she said. "The source of payment is listed as a trust fund, anonymous with no listed donor." I said nothing. 30 years, then 40, as if someone wanted to make sure that no one could touch it until the right hands came along. Anna explained the next steps: proof of identity, death certificate notarized, will signature verification. I handed over everything: the license, the documents, my father's death record. She scanned each page carefully, her movements steady, her eyes tracing the handwriting with quiet respect. When she looked up again, she smiled faintly. Everything matches, Mr. Carter. We'll schedule the opening for 9 a.m. tomorrow. I thanked her. Something in my chest loosened and tightened at the same time. It felt as though a thread stretched thin across 4 decades had just been plucked, soft, resonant, alive again. Before leaving, I asked, "Did anything about the file strike you as unusual?" She thought for a moment. Only one thing, she said. People almost never prepay that far ahead. When they do, it's because they want to make sure the box stays untouched until it's opened by the right person at the right time. Outside, the sun had risen higher, washing the city in a soft gold. Harbor Bank's facade glowed against the blue, the brass letters shimmering faintly, like a quiet signal meant for me alone. Sophie walked beside me, her hand brushing mine, a wordless exchange that said everything we needed. We found a cafe by the river, small and warm, smelling of roasted chestnuts and buttered pastry. Laughter drifted from a nearby table. I said, "He must have known he wouldn't have time to explain everything. Maybe he left what he couldn't say inside that box." Sophie stirred her coffee, thoughtful. "What do you think's in there?" "If it were money," I said, "he would have divided it differently. If it's documents, then maybe it's something he couldn't trust anyone else with." The afternoon moved slowly. The sunlight stretched across the river in pale gold ribbons. When we returned to the hotel, the sky had turned amber. From the window, I could see Harbor Bank at the corner, small but heavy, like a sealed memory, waiting for its turn to speak. Sophie sorted the papers again, precise as her grandfather would have been. When the streetlights came on, I sat by the desk and took out the photo. The lamplight skimmed across the edge of the paper, catching on the carved numbers. Oh, my father's expression in the picture seemed to change with the angle, half smile, half dare, as if reminding me that the game was never really over. Downstairs in the bank's night office, a phone rang softly. A man's voice asked, "Did they confirm the opening of 47A?" "Yes," the clerk said. 9 o'clock tomorrow." There was a brief pause. Then the man replied, "Call me the moment they arrive." I knew nothing of that call. Upstairs, in the quiet of the hotel room, I folded the photo and slid it into my wallet. Outside the window, the Savannah River moved like dark glass, catching bits of starlight. I drew a deep breath. Something inside my chest shifted slowly, gently, like a door beginning to open. It felt as if with every breath I was drawing closer to a secret my father had spent a lifetime trying to protect. The afternoon in Atlanta was hotter than usual. Sunlight spilled through the windshield, spreading across the steering wheel in a sharp white glare. Beside me, Sophie sat quiet, her gaze fixed ahead, as if the silence itself might break if she spoke. I could tell she wanted to say something, but only sighed instead. The phone vibrated on the console. Jonathan's name appeared, a name I hadn't wanted to see. His voice came through smooth as glass, the same mix of courtesy and calculation I remembered too well. He said he wanted to meet. Just the two of us at the company headquarters. Not about business, he claimed. Not about lawyers. Just family. I asked him why now. He said, "Because this is when the family needs to stand together more than ever." The line sounded rehearsed, like something he'd practiced in front of a mirror. I agreed, mostly to find out what he was afraid of. The Carter Holdings building rose out of Midtown like a mirror trying to outshine the sun. Its glass walls threw reflections onto the street, swallowing the sky. I'd helped my father draft the plans for its lobby when I was still an intern, long before anyone knew how far the building and the family would reach. Walking in now felt like stepping into someone else's memory. The place gleamed perfect and sterile with no trace of him left anywhere. Jonathan waited in the main conference room, standing by the far window. The white light from above struck the glass table cold and even. He wore a smoke-gray suit, his smile precise, symmetrical, practiced. 2 glasses of water sat on the table. A pot of tea. A thick folder already open. He walked over, hand extended, tone smooth as if hosting a segment on morning television. "I'm glad you came. We both want what's best for the family." I took a seat. He started talking, voice calm, deliberate, the rhythm of someone reading from a script. He spoke about the company's reputation, about old records that might be misunderstood, about the importance of unity. Every phrase carefully chosen to sound neutral, but underneath it all, the meaning was clear. He believed I had something our father left behind. I let him talk. Between his sentences, I could hear the hum of the air conditioner, steady and slow, like a measured pulse. He slid the folder toward me. Inside was a confidentiality agreement, the kind that promised inclusion while delivering silence. If I signed, he said they'd bring me back to the board, a gesture of goodwill. Each clause was written in the language of control, not trust. I asked, "And if I don't sign?" He didn't miss a beat. "Then everyone will be disappointed. And I think the last thing your father would have wanted is to see you damage the Carter name." I smiled faintly. That name, I said, was something he carried on his back alone for 40 years. He didn't flinch. "Are you afraid of something, Jonathan?" I asked. He looked up, his eyes clear and hollow. "Fear is for the weak, brother. I calculate." He poured water into both glasses, the sound quiet but precise. "We both know there are documents better left unseen," he said. "Old contracts, offshore accounts, transfers he made to private trusts. If anything like that surfaces, it won't help anyone." I looked down at the surface of the water, at the ripple trembling against the light. He continued, softer now. "If there's anything your father left you, anything, you should leave it closed. Opening it will only destroy what he built. Or I said it might show what he really built." The air between us thickened, heavy with things neither of us said. He stared for a long time, then closed the folder, sliding it aside with a slow, deliberate motion, the signal of someone who'd finished playing his part. When I rose, he added quietly, almost like an afterthought, "You may think I'm cold, but I'm doing what's necessary to protect the family." In the hallway, the elevator doors opened, and there was Elaine. She stepped out, wearing a brown coat, the scent of her perfume lingering before her. The same perfume that once clung to my shirts for years. She hesitated, then smiled, a small, practiced smile, thin as thread. Our eyes met, and I saw it there, not love, not guilt, but recognition. The look of someone who knows a secret and has chosen silence. Jonathan's voice came from behind me, calm as ever. "We're all just doing what's necessary to protect the family." I turned, met his gaze. "Maybe. But we don't all define family the same way." Outside, the parking lot shimmered in the afternoon glare. Heat radiated off the pavement, mixing with the smell of gas and sun-baked concrete. I stood still for a moment, looking back at the glass tower, reflecting the Atlanta sky, a perfect monument to ambition and forgetting. A chill ran down my spine. I knew then that whatever wall bore the name Carter, I was now standing on the other side of it. As I pulled onto the street, my phone buzzed again. A text from an unknown number. 4 words. "Don't open the box. No signature, no name, just the weight of warning. By the time I reached the hotel, the sun had begun to dip. Sophie called. I told her the meeting had been nothing more than theater. She asked what they wanted. Silence, I said. Night fell over the city, washing the skyline in steel and gold. From my window, the lights of Atlanta looked distant, indifferent. I took my father's photograph from my wallet, the edges soft, the paper slightly curled. The lamplight skimmed over the carved numbers, 47A. The ridges catching the glow like veins under skin. They could try to block me, buy me, frighten me. But they'd forgotten one thing: my father was the one who taught me how to read what's been erased. Tomorrow at 9 sharp, the box would open, and I would finally learn who among us was truly afraid of the light. 9 a.m. The air in the bank's basement was cold and dense, the kind of cold that felt older than memory, like the place hadn't seen sunlight in decades. The fluorescent lights cast a pale greenish hue on smooth concrete walls, reflecting off the floor in scattered shards of metal shine. I stood beside Sophie, my hands buried in my coat pockets, palms slick, despite the chill that hovered below 65 degrees. Anna Whitfield arrived on the dot. Her gray suit was crisp, her silver hair wound tight in a bun, her composure carrying the calm of someone who had seen too many moments people never forget. Her voice when she spoke was steady but soft. Everything had been verified, she said. Charles Carter's original signature remained intact, and she added almost reverently it was signed in blood. I looked down at the document she handed me. The ink had dried to a dull brown, darker, where it had pooled, spreading faintly like bruised light. My father's habit to leave a mark, even when it had to be his own. Anna keyed in a code and turned the dial 3 full rotations. The sound of metal shifting deep within the wall rolled through the room, heavy and rhythmic like an old machine exhaling. Then a muffled click. The steel door, half a meter thick, opened slow. A draft of cold air slipped out, smelling faintly of iron paper and time. Inside, hundreds of small boxes lined the wall, each one a silent note in the symphony of secrets. Anna stepped to box 47A, inserted the key, and nodded to me. When the door swung open, I expected something tangible: gold bonds, a clear measure of value. But there was only a single envelope sealed in gray wax. Pressed into the wax was the Carter family crest, a small crown over 3 interlocking letters, CHC. In the center, written in my father's unmistakable hand, for William only when truth matters. I didn't touch it right away. I let the silence fill the room as if the moment itself was listening. Sophie stood close, her eyes tracing my face. I gave a small nod, and Anna handed me a letter opener. The blade slid through the seal with a dry, deliberate sound, like the tearing of memory. A faint scent of burnt wax drifted up. Inside were 3 bundles of documents. I laid them out in order side by side on the glass table and began to read. The first was my father's original will, dated August 14th, 1987. I read every line slowly. Near the end, the words struck through me like current Carter Holdings, 51% ownership to William Carter, my eldest son, for stewardship, not possession. For stewardship, not possession. That was his way. He'd once told me a company shouldn't be owned, it should be carried like a bridge. I understood now what he meant. He hadn't chosen me to inherit. He'd chosen me to keep watch. The second folder was worse. A share transfer agreement dated 2019. My own signature at the bottom, but not mine. The forgery was meticulous, copied from an older document layered over a scan. The date aligned perfectly with the week of my accident, the week I was in a hospital bed, drugged and half-conscious. The notary stamp belonged to the same law firm Margaret had used for family transactions. I turned each page. The paper was crisp, too clean. The language clinical, absolute. A theft dressed as legality. Sophie leaned close, whispering, "They took everything while you were lying in a hospital bed." I didn't answer. I closed the folder. Something inside me dropped and turned cold. The third file was thinner, almost weightless. It was sealed in a clear plastic sleeve. Inside, a DNA test, dated 1992, name Daniel Carter. I read it slowly, the way one reads something that might change gravity. The final line came like the sound of glass breaking underwater. Result not biologically related to William Carter. I couldn't speak. The words blurred, but their meaning stayed sharp. Every memory driving him to school, his first scraped knee, the arguments, the pride suddenly felt like they'd been lifted and dropped into another world, one that no longer included me. Sophie's voice trembled. "Dad." I placed a hand on her shoulder. Some truths, if spoken aloud, break the heart faster. I just stared at the line not biologically related and felt the floor of myself collapse into silence. Anna stood quietly, then spoke again, her composure barely holding. "There's one more thing you should know," she said. "Early this morning before you arrived, Carter Holdings sent an urgent request to freeze Box 47A for internal audit reasons." I declined. "They have no legal authority." I met her eyes. "Thank you," I managed my voice barely sound. She nodded. "As protocol requires, I'll issue 2 certified copies of today's opening for record. You'll need to sign and keep one." She printed the forms, stamped them, and slid them toward me. As the pen left her hand, footsteps echoed from the corridor outside, measured heavy drawing closer. A sound anyone who's ever been followed would know instantly. Anna glanced toward the door, lowering her voice. 2 men in dark suits just entered the lobby. No appointment, no badges. Sophie's hand tightened around mine. Anna pressed the envelope copies into my palm. "Take these," she whispered. "You don't need to stay." I nodded, slid the documents into my leather case, and guided Sophie toward the hall. As we passed the vault, I looked back once. The steel door stood open, white light spilling onto the empty envelope, the scent of wax and lead still lingering. On the table, my father's handwriting caught the light only when truth matters. Outside, the noon sun struck hard, forcing my eyes to narrow. Savannah's air was heavy with salt and heat, but inside my bones, I felt winter. Sophie drove. I stayed silent, one hand gripping the folder against my chest. In the rearview mirror, 2 men stepped out of the bank. One of them spoke into a phone, eyes locked on our car. I turned away. The road ahead stretched narrow and bright, the wind carrying the scent of moss and the faintest trace of rust. I opened my wallet and looked at the photo again, my father standing before the same building decades earlier. His gaze, once distant, now seemed to look straight at me, as if saying, "Now you understand." Sophie asked softly, "Dad, are you okay?" I think I said, "I just started breathing again." We followed the river road, sunlight glancing off the water in quicksilver flashes. The certified envelope pressed against my chest, with every breath rustling faintly a second heartbeat. And I knew, with a clarity that felt almost holy, that from this moment on, no one in the Carter family would ever return to what they were. What my father had hidden inside that vault was never just the truth. It was the spark of a storm he'd planned long before he died. Grace Monroe's office smelled like thyme and law paper ink and oak steeped in smoke. I walked in, still carrying the damp breath of the Savannah River. On her desk, a stack of case files rose almost half a foot high, perfectly squared, as if each sheet of paper were waiting for permission to breathe. Grace looked up when I entered. Her hair was cropped silver, her glasses black-rimmed, her eyes the kind that could read a client's mood by the way they turned a doorknob. She stood extended, a hand dry, firm, cold. "I heard you found the 47A box," she said. I nodded. "I need everything verified before it disappears." I set the sealed envelope on her desk. Grace adjusted her glasses, opened it carefully, lifting each document between her fingers with deliberate precision. When the light hit a line of text, she tilted the page slightly, checking the ink, the handwriting, the notary marks. At the page bearing my father's blood signature, she reached for a magnifier, studied it close, and finally murmured, "It can't be forged." Even the wax seal, Charles used a specific batch of these only 3 boxes ever made from a workshop in Chicago. She took notes in a small leather ledger, each line written in her immaculate, slanted hand. At last, she set down her pen and exhaled. "William," she said quietly, "this is all valid. If released, Carter Holdings collapses in a week." I didn't speak. The curtain near the window swayed faintly, and sunlight fell across her desk in narrow stripes. She went on, "But you can't just walk out of here holding this. They won't let it stand. We need a safety protocol." Grace pulled a legal form from her drawer and began to write, her voice deliberate, crisp with authority. "I'll send a sealed copy to Judge Emily Chen's chambers in Chatham County. She's incorruptible. She'll preserve it under judicial custody. At the same time, I'll file a motion for evidentiary preservation. Any interference will be treated as obstruction of federal justice." I watched her handwriting, dark blue ink, steady strokes, each letter shaped like a promise. "I don't want to go public yet," I said. "I want them to think I know nothing. I want the truth to show itself when they believe they've already won." Grace looked up, studying me over her glasses. "You're giving them rope, aren't you?" "No," I said. "I'm waiting to see who pulls first." She was silent for a few moments, then nodded. "I understand. But let me keep a copy, not for you, for the record. For the truth." She resealed the envelope, signed across the flap, and called her assistant to lock it in the back archive. When the door closed, the room fell into a stillness so deep I could hear the clock tick on the far wall. Grace leaned back and spoke softly. "I worked with your father once. He didn't believe in luck, only in evidence. You're following the same path, William. But remember, that same faith made him a lonely man." I was about to answer when the door opened. Elaine stepped in. She wore a light coat collar, turned up, her perfume familiar enough to tighten the air. She hesitated, then smiled, polite, brittle. "I came to speak privately with Mrs. Monroe," she said. "Family matters. Nothing legal." Grace closed her notebook and gestured to a chair. Elaine sat opposite, her fingers turning the ring on her hand. Her tone softened, every word measured. "You understand, Mrs. Monroe, every family has things better left unsaid. I think there's a way for everyone to stay at peace, as long as those documents never reach the court. We could arrange something quietly." Grace regarded her for a long moment. She didn't speak. The air thickened until the only sound was a pen rolling off the desk. Then her voice came calm but sharp as a scalpel. "I work for the law, not for fear. If you came to bury the truth, you came to the wrong office." Elaine's lips tightened. Her composure wavered just long enough to show the fracture beneath. She straightened her coat, and smiled a thin, painted smile. "No one in this family wants a scandal," she said evenly. "But if he," she glanced at me, "takes this public, don't blame us for what follows." She left. Her heels struck the wood in a slow, deliberate rhythm, each step echoing like a small gavel in memory. When the door shut, Grace's eyes lingered on it. That woman, she said, voice low, isn't afraid of losing her reputation. She's afraid of losing her position. She moved to the filing cabinet and withdrew another envelope. This came in this morning, she said, handing it to me, from a contact at the IRS. Inside was a memo stamped in red, Internal Revenue Service, Carter Holdings flagged for audit. Below that, a list of irregular transfers spanning 3 years dividend funds shell companies in Delaware and Wyoming. Grace spoke slowly. The IRS has placed Carter Holdings under review. That's not coincidence. They know something's leaked. They're trying to clean house. I stared at the page, feeling my heartbeat slow and thicken. If the IRS steps in, I said quietly, everything comes apart. She nodded. And if that's the case, then Charles planned for it. He didn't just leave a will, William. He left a mechanism, a trigger. I sat in silence for a long while. Outside wind stirred through the magnolia trees, scattering sunlight across her oak desk like flecks of gold dust. Grace's tone softened. I'll send the sealed copy by evening. For now, stay quiet. Let them think you haven't read it all. I rose, gathered the files, and thanked her. She gripped my hand briefly, her eyes bright but weary. William, she said sometimes, justice doesn't need to be won. It just needs to stay alive long enough to find its way. When I stepped outside, the Savannah noon had turned hot, the air shimmering above the street. Sophie was waiting in the car. What did Mrs. Monroe say? She asked. I closed the door, glanced once more at the red brick building behind us, stretching its shadow down the sidewalk. She said, I told her the truth has started to breathe. Sophie didn't answer. She just started the engine. In my pocket, the IRS envelope felt heavy, like the weight of my father's hand still guiding me, still watching to see if I had the courage to follow where his truth would lead. I arrived home just before 10. The clock on the oven glowed faintly in the dark kitchen. The house by the Charleston Bay sat quiet under low lamps. Only the living room was lit. The TV murmured in the background, the financial news showing the glass towers of Carter Holdings, the company that bore my father's name, now owned by someone else. Elaine was on the sofa, her coat draped over her shoulders, a glass of red wine turning slow in her hand. She didn't look up when she heard the door. You met with Grace Monroe, she said, her tone calm, detached too, even to be honest. I froze. You've been following me. She turned eyes cold but uneasy. I didn't need to. Jonathan told me. I walked closer, set my keys on the table. Did he tell you the rest? I asked. That he and Margaret forged my signature, transferred every share of Carter Holdings into his name while I was lying in a hospital bed, or that he's Daniel's real father? The glass trembled in her hand. A drop of wine spilled dark against the wood floor. She inhaled, steadying herself. So you know, I do, I said quietly. There's nothing left to hide. Her hands clasped together, shaking slightly. I never meant to lie forever. But you were gone for years, William. You buried yourself in work. Jonathan, he was there. He helped, he said things you'd stopped saying. I stared at her, not angry, just emptied out. So you chose my brother. You betrayed me. You betrayed my father. You even betrayed the boy you said was mine. Her voice broke. Not at first. I wanted to stop. But when Daniel was born, I knew there was no way back. I laughed once the sound sharp in the still room. You think I didn't see the distance between us? I just didn't want to believe it. She looked up, eyes wet. I still loved you, William. even if it was the wrong kind of love. I held her gaze. And that love, does it still exist? Her lips trembled. A tear fell. No, she whispered. We lost it a long time ago. The upstairs door opened. Daniel came down each step, loud, deliberate. His shirt was half-buttoned, his breathing short. So it's true, he said. You're dragging us all down with you. Be careful how you speak, I said. I don't need to, he snapped. You're destroying everything grandfather built. You think anyone will believe you? A bitter old man kicked out of his own company. I looked straight at him. You talk about honor like you've ever known what it means. He stepped closer, voice rising. I know that company feeds hundreds of families, and you'd rather burn it down just to feel powerful. You're just like him, Charles Carter, so obsessed with control, you can't see the damage you do. Sophie had appeared in the hallway by then. Don't you dare talk to him that way, she said. Daniel turned, sneering. And what about you, Sophie? Still worshipping the fallen hero? He's not a victim. He's just bitter that he didn't get what he wanted. I said nothing. I reached into my coat and took out a white envelope, set it on the table. This, I said evenly, is your DNA test, Daniel. When you're ready to face yourself, open it. He stared at it, smirking. Is that supposed to scare me? I don't need to scare you, I said. Truth doesn't need help speaking. Elaine moved to him, hand on his arm. William, please. You don't have to do this. I looked at them, the two of them, and the house seemed to tilt away like a room in someone else's life. I've spent 20 years not doing this, I said. I stayed quiet for peace, for appearance, for the illusion of a family. But tonight, I'm done. Her voice trembled. You're leaving. I didn't answer. Upstairs, I pulled a suitcase from the closet, folded clothes packed like a man sealing the past into boxes. Each zip of the bag sounded like a door closing. When I came down, Daniel had turned away, fists clenched. Elaine stood frozen. Sophie was on the stairs. Small suitcase in hand, eyes red. I'm going with you, she said. Elaine spun toward her. Sophie, don't. You don't understand. I understand perfectly, Sophie said. I can't live like this anymore. No one spoke again. I opened the door. The night wind swept in salt pine and something colder. The door closed behind us with a sound that felt like the end of a chapter. The road along the river was empty. Streetlights stretched thin across the water, breaking apart in the breeze. I drove. Sophie sat silent beside me. When we reached the small wooden house by the dock, I unloaded the bags. It was the place where my father and I had drafted our first design together. Now it was where I'd start over. Inside, the air smelled of dust and wet wood. I sat at the old desk and called Grace. She answered on the first ring. I need to activate the preservation order, I said. My voice was steady low. Tonight. Papers rustled on her end. Are you certain, William? Once it's filed, there's no turning back. I never had a way back, I said. A pause. Then I'll log it in the federal court system within 10 minutes. Once it's sealed, they can't erase a single record tied to Carter Holdings. Any interference becomes a federal offense. The sound of her typing filled the line, quick, rhythmic, like a countdown. Charles once told me, she said quietly, justice isn't a lamp, it's a flame. It shines for a while and then it burns through everything in its path. I didn't reply. Outside the window, the river glimmered under the moon. The wind carried the scent of salt and rain. Sophie sat beside me, eyes distant. Dad, she asked softly, Where does this end? I took her hand. Where your grandfather always meant it to, I said. At the truth. The wind rose, brushing against the walls. The little house creaked with it, the river whispering below. And sitting there, I felt something I hadn't in years. No fear, no anger, just the quiet certainty that from this night forward, the storm had truly begun. Morning in Charleston came draped in silver fog. The first light slid across the river like a cold blade catching on ripples that moved without hurry. I sat by the window of the small house, the coffee long gone cold, the phone still buzzing with calls I hadn't answered. On the screen, the name Jonathan Carter blinked, disappeared, and returned again. I didn't pick up. I just watched the fishing boats cut through the water, calm and steady, as if the world hadn't started shaking yet. Grace called at 8. Her voice was rougher than usual, threaded with the sound of papers turning and a keyboard clicking. William, the IRS, has handed everything to the state's Financial Crimes Division. They're expanding into international transfers. I just spoke with Detective Aaron Brooks, the lead investigator. We're past the stage of suspicion now. I asked, what exactly did they find? Money transfers from Carter Holdings to a series of shell companies in Delaware. From there, the trail goes to the Cayman Islands, then into a private trust under Margaret's name, with Jonathan listed as the trustee. Everything matches the internal memos Charles left years ago. She paused, her voice lowering. The search warrants were signed this morning. Aaron and his team are en route to headquarters. I felt my pulse slow, each beat deliberate. Part of me wanted to go there to see the building fall under its own weight, but another part knew I didn't need to. My father had set this board long before I ever understood the game. I was only moving the final piece. Sophie rested her hand on my shoulder. Dad, will they be okay? I looked at her. They never cared about being okay, Sophie. They cared about being safe. And today they're neither. Grace's tone sharpened. Aaron will send me updates directly. They'll enter Carter Holdings at 9:15. Stay where you are. I know you want to see it, but if you show up, they'll call you a participant. Don't give them that. I stood, stepping out onto the balcony. From somewhere downtown came the faint wail of sirens, a sound like a city waking up. I watched the river and said quietly, "Let the law do its work." Atlanta, same hour. Jonathan arrived at the office wearing his usual smile, navy suit, red tie, confidence pressed and polished. He was mid-sentence with his assistant when 4 black SUVs from the investigation unit pulled up to the main entrance. 20 minutes later, the entire 8th floor, the executive level of Carter Holdings, was sealed off. Detective Aaron Brooks, broad-shouldered and calm, stepped inside with a team of agents. In accordance with a Georgia state court order, he announced all data belonging to Carter Holdings is to be secured for financial investigation. A secretary gasped. Jonathan burst out of the boardroom trying to steady his voice. "This must be a mistake. I'm the CEO here, you can't just—" Brooks held up the warrant. "We can, and we are." Servers were shut down, drives removed, and employees escorted out one by one. The hum of power was replaced by silence. Then Margaret appeared wrapped in a fur coat, her face carved from stone. She scanned the room, found Jonathan, and leaned in close. "Someone betrayed us." He shook his head. "No. They're just playing Father's endgame." When Brooks motioned for 2 agents to collect a set of binders, Jonathan lunged forward. "That's personal property. It's not part of the company." Brooks's voice cut clean through the noise. "And you just committed obstruction of justice." The cuffs clicked cold around Jonathan's wrists. The metallic snap echoed off the glass walls, freezing the room in place. Margaret's hand trembled. A young employee hurried over, whispering to Brooks. "The bank just confirmed Margaret Carter is listed as beneficiary to the Cayman Trust." Brooks nodded. "Bring the car around." Margaret straightened, her voice shaking. "You don't understand, those are family trusts," Brooks interrupted, his tone low but firm. "And the forged will, Mrs. Carter, is that a family matter too?" She went silent. When the agents approached, she lifted her chin, clinging to the last trace of pride. "William did this," she said, voice breaking. "He destroyed his own inheritance." Brooks met her eyes. "No, ma'am. You destroyed it. He just turned on the light." That afternoon, I sat on the porch by the river, watching Sophie make tea in the kitchen. My phone buzzed. Grace again. "Text warrants executed. Jonathan detained for obstruction. Margaret in federal custody for fraud and will falsification." I read the words slowly. I didn't feel triumph. Only the strange, hollow calm that follows a long storm, the feeling of wind moving through a space that had been sealed for too long. I typed back, "Thank you. Let the law finish it." A few minutes later, her reply came. "Charles would be proud. But William, be ready. People who lose power don't go quietly." I set the phone down and looked out at the water. The river had turned the color of copper, reflecting the low sun. Sophie stepped out with 2 cups of tea, her voice quiet. "Is it over, Dad?" I shook my head. "No, sweetheart. This is where justice starts collecting its debt." The wind picked up, carrying the faint echo of sirens again. Somewhere Charleston reminded me that in a country built on law and consequence, liars might prosper for a while, but no one hides from the light forever. That morning, Charleston was unnervingly clear. Sunlight slipped through the rows of magnolias outside the county courthouse, touching the line of reporters and cameras waiting at the gate. Inside, the halls smelled faintly of polished wood and fresh coffee. As I walked between rows of whispering strangers, I could feel their eyes following me the way people look when they know they're watching the end of something old. Grace Monroe had arrived early, wearing a gray suit that matched her calm. Her face held the composure of someone who's already mapped every corner of the battlefield. She set a 3-inch thick file on the counsel table, adjusted her glasses, and said quietly, "It's going to be a long day, William. Speak only when I signal." I nodded, breathing deep. Across the aisle, Margaret and Jonathan sat side by side, 2 portraits of exhausted arrogance. Jonathan avoided my gaze. Margaret forced a smile for the cameras, her hand trembling over her coffee cup. When Judge Emily Chen entered the courtroom, fell still. 3 strikes of the gavel echoed like distant thunder. This hearing between Mr. William Carter and the representatives of Carter Holdings regarding inheritance and executive control is now in session. Grace rose. "Your Honor, I represent Mr. William Carter. Today we submit verified documentation establishing my client's lawful inheritance under the original will of the late Charles Carter, held in Safe Deposit Box 47A at Harbor Bank, Savannah." A murmur rippled through the room. A reporter outside pressed a recorder closer to the door. Grace placed the file on the bench. "This document bears a full chain of custody signed and sealed by hand and in blood on August 14, 1987. It is accompanied by Harbor Bank's verification and an authenticated signature analysis from the State Bureau of Examination. The opposing counsel." A tall, thin man with a red-striped tie stood. "Your Honor, the company possesses a will publicly read at the funeral duly signed by the late chairman. It designates Mrs. Margaret Carter and Mr. Jonathan Carter as successors in control. Judge Chen flipped through the pages before her, her tone level but cool. This version you reference, where is its chain of custody and who notarized it? The lawyer hesitated. She is darting toward his clients. The records were misplaced during a relocation in 2020. Silence spread heavy and full. The judge nodded slowly. The court notes the absence of a valid custody record. Therefore, the funeral version carries no legal standing. She turned to Grace. Does your submission include the original registry code? Grace slid the file forward, her voice precise. Yes, Your Honor. Registry code CA8722135, matching the Charleston notary record of 1987, and the corresponding entry at Harbor Bank. At her signal, I stood and presented the certified copy sealed in wax. Under the lights, the Carter crest gleamed faintly. Margaret's face drained of color. Jonathan shot to his feet. This is a forgery. He fabricated this to steal what belongs to my father. Grace lifted an eyebrow, her words clean and cutting. To your father or our father, Jonathan Charles Carter had one legally registered son born at St. Mary's Hospital in 1965. His name was William Carter. You, sir, are the child of an extramarital affair, and this document proves it. Jonathan staggered back. Margaret's hand clutched his arm. You have no right to humiliate us here, she cried. The gavel struck hard. Order. Judge Chen's voice sliced through the noise. The room fell still again. She reviewed the signatures, the seals, the blood mark itself. Then she spoke. All evidence is valid. The court issues an interim ruling recognizing Mr. William Carter as the lawful heir and granting him controlling authority over 51% of Carter holdings until the civil proceedings resume. Effective immediately, Mrs. Margaret Carter and Mr. Jonathan Carter are prohibited from managing or transferring any company assets. Margaret rose, voice breaking. You can't take everything I built. I ran that company for 10 years, the judge replied, calm as frost. 10 years without legal authority. The court will not allow a continued breach of fiduciary trust. Jonathan slammed his palm on the table. William, you want to see me in prison? Is that it? I looked at him, my voice even almost gentle. I only want to see my father respected. He didn't leave behind a fortune for greed to feed on. He left justice for those willing to guard it. Behind them, Elaine began to cry. The sound of tissues rustling was the only movement in the room. She lifted her head, eyes swollen. William, I'm sorry. I turned. I know I said softly, but apologies don't give back time. Then Daniel rose. He looked at me, then around the room, voice rough but clear. No matter what, you're still my father. The courtroom went silent again. I didn't smile, just felt the heat rise behind my eyes. Thank you, I said. That means more than you know. Grace tilted her head slightly, hiding whatever emotion flickered across her face. Judge Chen struck the gavel once more. Court adjourned. The next session will convene in 4 weeks. The press swarmed before we could leave. Mr. Carter, how does it feel to win? Someone shouted. I stopped at the doorway. I didn't win anything I said. I just kept what was right. By afternoon, every paper in Charleston ran the same headline, The Silent Heir. A photograph of me leaving the courthouse, gray suit, calm expression, spread across front pages. Carter Holdings stock steadied after a week of chaos, then rose modestly once the leadership notice went public. Later, in the quiet of my new office, I looked out across the riverfront as the sunset washed the skyline in gold. Somewhere in that hush, I could almost hear my father's voice again, steady, patient, a lesson from long ago. Don't win by words, son. Let time be the one that proves you were right. I closed my eyes, letting the sound of the gavel echo again in my mind, the last note of a symphony Charles Carter had begun, and the one I had finally brought to rest. Morning settled over Charleston like a quiet benediction, a thin veil of mist drifting above the water. Soft light slipping through the magnolia trees that lined the courthouse road. The river shimmered silver in the distance, patient and unhurried, as if time itself had chosen to move a little slower. 6 months had passed since the hearing. The old sign had been taken down, and in its place new letters gleamed against the glass facade. Carter and daughter. No press, no speeches, no champagne. Just a handful of workers tightening the final bolts, the faint clatter of a ladder, and then silence. When they stepped back, I stood alone beneath the morning sun, watching the reflection of those words shimmer in the windowpane. It felt less like a victory, more like a homecoming, as though my father had just smiled through the light and said, "You finally understood." Inside, the air carried a new kind of rhythm. The architecture studio no longer smelled of sterile ambition, but of fresh paint, coffee, and the hum of beginnings. The walls were pale and open-lined with sketches from scholarship students and community projects that bore names instead of budgets. Sophie stood near the drafting tables, her sleeves rolled up, showing a group of interns how to lay out foundation grids. Her voice was steady and warm, touched with a quiet authority I never possessed at her age. When she turned to me, her eyes were bright. "Dad, I want the foundation to focus on rebuilding zones, not luxury housing. I want people to have places they can stay in when storms come, not run from." I watched her for a long moment, 25, clear-eyed, the kind of steady light her grandfather used to be. In her, I saw the version of Charles Carter that never died, the builder who cared more about roofs than revenue, more about shelter than show. Daniel came around noon. He looked smaller somehow, not in stature, but in certainty. His clothes were simple, his hair uncombed, and his eyes carried that rare, unguarded honesty that only follows regret. "Can I come in?" he asked. Sophie nodded first. I stayed quiet. He glanced around the studio before speaking, voice low and raw. "I used to think this company was about power, about inheritance, but seeing it alive again, I realized it's not wealth, it's memory. It's proof that something built with integrity doesn't have to die. I know I failed you, Dad. I hurt you. But if there's still a way to make things right, I want to try." I poured him coffee, set the cup down, and said quietly, "Forgiveness doesn't erase the past, Daniel. It just means we stop letting it own us. If you're serious, go to Savannah next week. Repaint the walls. Fix the roof. Start from where your grandfather once stood." He nodded, eyes burning. "I will. Not for the company. For him." By dusk, Sophie and I walked along the river. The tide was low, the air sharp with salt. She leaned against the railing, watching the light fade over the marsh. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked softly. Everything that happened, I thought for a while before answering. "Yes," I said, "but not for what I lost. I regret all the years I kept quiet when I should have spoken." When we returned home, a single envelope sat on the table. The handwriting was familiar, graceful, deliberate. "Elaine." I hesitated before opening it. The paper smelled faintly of lavender and rain. "William." I left Charleston this morning. For years, I mistook silence for peace, but it was fear wearing a gentle mask. Fear of losing status, of losing you, of losing the illusion of a perfect wife in a house that never truly belonged to me. Jonathan knew that fear. He fed it. And I let him. I was wrong with you, with Daniel, with everyone. If someday you can forgive not me, but the frightened part of yourself that once thought silence was love. Elaine. I folded the letter and stepped outside. The river was the color of old bronze, slow-moving and certain. I lit a match and held the paper to the flame. It curled, blackened, and vanished into the breeze. Some truths, I whispered, find peace only in silence. A faint sound of footsteps approached from behind. I turned to see Grace Monroe still composed in her ash-gray suit, the kind of woman who'd seen enough trials to know that justice seldom needs applause. Burning letters again, she asked, her smile edged with affection and irony. I'm only keeping what's worth keeping. And what's that? The future. Sophie's. She nodded, then opened her briefcase and drew out a thick envelope. I came to deliver some good news. The Carter Architectural Foundation has just received its first major endowment. I frowned. From whom anonymous donor, she said. Signed only as Charles. My fingers trembled slightly as I opened it. Inside lay a check for $500,000 and a small handwritten note. For the next generation, the ones who build, not inherit. Grace smiled faintly. Maybe an old friend of your father's, she said. Or someone trying to finish what he started. I looked back toward the river. The ashes from Elaine's letter drifted like gray petals above the water. Or maybe I said softly, he never really left. That night, I returned to the studio by the river. On the wall hung the design for our first community home, simple lines. Open courtyards. Wide porches built to hold conversations and weather both. Above it, Sophie had written in chalk, the Charles Carter Community House. I sat down and signed the grant papers. The ink spread cleanly, no tremor, no hesitation. When I set the pen aside, a breeze passed through the open window, carrying with it the smell of salt wood and something deeper, the scent of forgiveness. At the end of the hall, Sophie turned off the lights, leaving only the glow of a scale model on the table, a small house with a curved roof and a warm golden light flickering through its windows. I stood there a long time watching the way that little house seemed to breathe, and I thought Carter and daughter. Not an empire, a legacy. Outside, the Charleston River kept flowing slow, patient, eternal, like the steady breath of a father who once built with his hands and left behind the one truth that never fades, that justice may wander, but it always finds its way home. The afternoon light in Charleston carried that particular kind of gold I've always thought was reserved for endings, deep slanted, tender and slow, like a single thread stitching the past to the present. The new Carter and Daughter workshop had its river-facing windows open wide. The air moved through with the scent of welded steel, fresh pine, and the damp sweetness of tidewater. I stood before the main wall, one section still a lighter shade, a pale rectangle where an old photograph had hung for years. Sophie stood on a wooden chair, carefully cleaning the glass of that same photo, my father, Charles Carter, in front of the Harbor Bank building. Red brick walls behind him, a fedora in one hand, that faint, knowing smile, eyes looking far past the camera. On the edge of the frame, still faintly visible, was his handwriting, "For my son who remembers. Safe 47A." I took the frame from her hands, the weight both familiar and unsparing. For years it had rested inside a small wooden box, the same one people used to mock as the poor man's inheritance. But inside that box was everything I'd carried through the long road back to myself, the truth. Here, Sophie asked, stepping down, still holding the frame. I nodded. The same spot, same direction. Your grandfather always chose places where sunlight entered the room but never blinded it. She smiled softly. Maybe he wanted to remind himself never to live in the dark. I said nothing. I only lifted the frame and hooked it onto the wall. The glass met the plaster with a faint sound, and the sunlight hit just right, illuminating his face so vividly I had to take a step back. For a second, I was 10 again, standing in his office while he talked about natural light in architecture. He used to say light was the most honest element in a building. It never lied about direction or shape. Maybe he believed the same about people. Sophie reached into a cloth case and pulled out my father's old Leica film camera, the one he used to document his early projects. She adjusted the focus ring, looked through the viewfinder, and said quietly, "Don't move, Dad. I want to take your picture from the exact same angle he stood when this was taken." I chuckled. "Does that old thing even work?" "It does," she smiled. I fixed the lens. "I want to capture this light," Grandpa used to say. "Film fades, but light never dies." I stood still. The shutter clicked a sound so small, yet it seemed to hold a lifetime. In that instant, 3 generations shared the same frame: my father in the past, me in the present, and Sophie somewhere in between, holding the bridge steady. When she finished, she looked at the photo on the wall and said, "I'm going to use this shot for the Foundation's first exhibition. I'm calling it The House That Truth Built." I smiled. "That's a good name." He'd like that. "And you?" she asked. I think I said slowly, "It's the house I rebuilt, not with bricks or money, but with truth." Outside across the river, I could see the Charles Carter Community House nearing completion. From the window, the sound of hammers mixed with wind. Students from the foundation were lifting beams into place, the light wood catching the sun. One young builder looked up and waved. I waved back. For a moment, amid the noise and motion, I thought I could hear my father's heartbeat, steady, unresentful. As evening came, Sophie walked down to the docks. I stayed behind. On my desk sat an envelope that had arrived earlier. The handwriting was neat, deliberate, from Elaine Carter. I unfolded the letter. "William, I've left Charleston. I once believed silence meant safety, but it only strangles honesty, one quiet day at a time. I let Jonathan use my fear of losing image, of losing place, of losing myself. When you stood in that courtroom, I finally saw it. What you protected wasn't power. It was character, something I had abandoned long ago. Thank you for not destroying me when you had every reason to. Elaine." I folded the letter, walked outside, and stood by the river. The wind carried the tang of salt and fresh paint from the construction site across the water. I struck a match, held the paper to it, and watched it burn, curling, turning to smoke, drifting away. "Some truths," I said quietly, "are meant to be known, not kept." When I turned back, Grace Monroe was at the door, her coat open, an envelope in hand. "Still burning letters, I see," she said, a small smile flickering. "I only keep what can stand in the light," I replied. She stepped forward. "Then here's something you can keep." She handed me the envelope. The foundation just received its first grant. Anonymous donor. Signed, Charles. I hesitated, then opened it. Inside was a check, $500,000, and a note written in an old, familiar hand for the next generation who builds, not inherits. Grace watched my face. Any idea who that might be? I looked out toward the water, where the sunset shimmered gold, just like the photo behind me. "I'm not sure," I said. "Maybe an old friend of my father's. Or maybe he never really left." I adjusted the frame on the wall just a little. The sunlight hit the glass, lighting my father's face again, the face of a man who understood that real worth never comes from possession, but from how you stand when everything else is taken. Sophie came in, then holding the roll of film. "Dad," she said, "I think the picture turned out beautifully." I placed a hand on her shoulder. "You know, I said they took the house, the cars, even the name off the company door. All I had left was an old box of photographs. But inside that box was everything your grandfather wanted me to keep: truth, memory, and dignity." I paused, glancing around the studio, glowing with late light. My voice dropped to a near whisper. "Your grandfather used to say, a man isn't measured by what he owns, but by what he protects when he's stripped of everything." Maybe after all this time he was right. The evening wind swept through the room. The photograph trembled slightly on its hook, then stilled. Sophie looked up and smiled, and I saw the sunlight spill across the wall like a river flowing backward, carrying memory home. "Thank you for staying with this story. If it reminded you of something worth keeping, justice, memory, or the small moments that shape who we are, tap. Leave your thoughts in the comments and share it forward. Because sometimes a single photograph can carry the truth all the way home."